Justice Kennedy, thank you very much for this opportunity to visit with you this morning on the 138th birthday of President Harry S. Truman. It is also notable that this is the 50th anniversary of our foundation luncheons that began with Chief Justice Earl Warren back in 1972. Justice Kennedy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zobrist, for the gracious introduction and for the gracious invitation to this important, celebratory, historic luncheon to celebrate this great award. It is a great honor, a marvelous distinction, a memorable time for me to receive this award. It is made particularly impressive and inspiring for me to know that the two previous recipients, General Meyer and Secretary Panetta, have received the award and are gracious enough to participate in this afternoon's event. The Secretary and the General, by their careers, demonstrate the importance and the meaning and the significance of what Harry Truman did and of what this award means. They made difficult, countless decisions over long careers, decisions that sometimes involve life and death, that involve some of the most significant issues of our time. And how did they do that? They did so with civility, with thoughtfulness, with respect for those who disagreed with them, with recognition of the importance of rational, civil, thoughtful dialogue in any nation that seeks to be free. And they did so with an awareness of the meaning and the purpose of this nation. They did so with the understanding of the history of that nation and of its purpose. The history of our nation is first to ensure freedom for ourselves, and second, to do whatever we can to be an example, to give it to the rest of the world. Each generation must do that. It was with perhaps some trepidation, Mr. Zobrist, that my remarks were being delivered to so many people who know so much about Harry S. Truman. But then it came to my attention that many young people are here, young people who are just about to start on a career in which they should and which they must know the history, the meaning, and the purpose of this nation. And Harry Truman taught us that. Harry Truman taught that the meaning of this nation and its history must be understood and must be valued. Of course, our history shows there are certain flaws. It takes time for us to see human errors. But that's the excitement about a free and decent and dignity people. They can see what's wrong and change it, but without ignoring the past, without a misunderstanding of history and what it teaches. The young people here have a marvelous opportunity to study Harry S. Truman and to see what he did and what he meant for this nation and how he inspired this nation. Harry S. Truman had challenges, crises, decisions, which can be numbered in the double digits, and any one of them might have been a landmark for some other president. But Senator and then later President Truman confronted these crises and did so in a way that showed all of us that the presidency can be conducted and should be conducted by a person of decency and dignity, who knows and understands the history of this nation, because the history of this nation shows its meaning. What were just some of the landmark events in Truman's presidency? We could go on and on. There is a book written by Professor Frank on Truman's life, and it's called The Trials of Harry S. Truman, and then the subtitle is An Extraordinary Presidency of an Ordinary Man. And in a way that sums up much of what we can think about here today. It was an extraordinary presidency because of the events that occurred during it. Within days of his taking office, World War II officially ended in Europe. He then had to make the decision to withdraw any number of troops quickly to go to Japan and to confront the coming war in Japan. In my hometown of Sacramento, if you travel east toward the Sierra Nevada mountains, you first come to the foothills, and in those foothills you see rows and rows of small buildings that are now used as storage shed. Those were built because we anticipated tens of thousands of wounded people if the Japanese war had continued and we had invaded Japan. And so he made the decision to drop the atomic bomb. That decision perhaps saved thousands of lives, both Japanese and American. But Truman knew that this could not be the justification, because in any war, any leader would think that they are on the right side and that it would help everybody to drop the atomic bomb. And so he took steps at once to ensure that the UN was powerful. He wanted the United Nations on a Wilson-type philosophy to ensure that the enormity of dropping an atomic bomb would never occur again. And he devoted great efforts to this in supporting the United Nations. As it turned out, we do not have a body that can prevent the use of atomic weapons. And in our own day, as we sit here this afternoon, the potential, the enormity of the disaster of using one of these weapons has come again before us. And so Truman had to make this decision, and he did. In Europe, there was much left to do. In the winter of 1946-47 was one of the most severe winters in 100 years in Europe. We had thought, the United States and the West had thought, that all of the bridges had been destroyed, the roads had been destroyed, the railroad tracks had been destroyed, but the rivers were left to bring in food and supply, but the rivers froze. And in Salzburg, some friends of mine have told me, who were my age and remember that winter, that they would have to take turns staying up at night to guard one chicken, because that was the only source of food that a family of five would have. That was the beginning of the Marshall Plan under Truman's administration. And Truman, in a way, was pleased that it was called the Marshall Plan, because Truman himself was unpopular. Right after World War II ended, Truman had the Truman Doctrine. England did not have the resources or the capacity to defend Greece against a communist invasion. And so Truman sent our troops to do this and announced the Truman Doctrine, which was that communism would not be allowed to expel further. Remember, in Europe, after World War II, things were most unsettled. In one of the first major elections in France in 1946, over 25% of the voters voted for communists. In Italy, the same. In Czechoslovakia, the same. This was the world. This was the Europe that Truman faced. And so he had the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine and then NATO. This was all in Europe. Then came the Berlin crisis, in which the Soviets closed Berlin to access from the Western powers in the United States and England. And there was consideration of whether or not we should fight our way in, but we had the Berlin airlift, a remarkable success. This too was a landmark under Truman's leadership. Turning to Asia, Mao Zedong defeated the nationalist government, and then the Korean War began. Truman committed our troops to Korea and made that decision, committing us to a war half a world away in which we knew there would be thousands of casualties. And of course, he had Douglas MacArthur as his commander in the Pacific and in Korea. That brings us to the MacArthur incident. Truman went to see MacArthur for the first time. Perhaps they had not met. My guess is they had not met before. And they met on Wake Island, which is not quite halfway, but so the president didn't have to fly all the way to Japan. But MacArthur kept the president waiting. MacArthur wanted the president to greet MacArthur out of the plane, not vice versa. And the president said, "Don't keep your president waiting again." But they conferred and they agreed on what the strategy should be. So it seemed. But then we had the problem that the Chinese communists were massing forces just over the border of North Korea in Manchuria and coming down in great numbers. We had gone all the way almost to the North Korean border, and now we were being pushed all the way back. And so MacArthur, with considerable logic, said that we should bomb across the border in those places where the Chinese forces were being assembled. Truman said no. He wanted to contain this war. He did not want a war in which we were involved with China. One of the concerns was that if we did that, Stalin might move into Western Europe. Stalin had far more divisions than we did in Western Europe. Recent scholarship says that Stalin decided that he would not intervene, but we're not sure of that. But then MacArthur began to undercut the president, and the president relieved him of his status as commander. The nation was shocked. Truman was already unpopular, MacArthur a great hero, and the newspapers said captain. Truman had been a captain in World War I. Captain fires general. And there were massive protests. MacArthur gave a speech to the Congress, which was broadcast to all the United States. Those were my years in junior high school, and my memory is very clear of hearing that speech. And the speech ended, "I still remember an old barracks ballad which proudly proclaimed that old soldiers never die, they just fade away. I now close my years of military service, and like that old soldier, just fade away. a soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye. Oh, the nation was in tears. There was a ticker tape parade for MacArthur in New York. MacArthur was maybe going to run for president, but Eisenhower was already in the mix. But there were two aspects of that decision. One, should the general be, in effect, fired for disobeying his commander? That was fairly easy. My father told me at the time that Truman did absolutely the right thing. The second thing was on the merits, whether we should go into Manchuria or contain the war. And scholars can still argue about that. But Truman made the decision, and he made it again, knowing that the important thing was what the United States meant to other people in the world because of how it behaved, and that is what you people who were so young must begin to do. Let me quickly talk about the 4 justices that Truman appointed to the court during his presidency. The first was Harold Burton. Soon after Truman came into office, he replaced Justice Owen Roberts. Burton was a Republican, a friend of Truman, had served with Truman on a very important committee, and Truman was a good friend of his, and he appointed Burton after thinking about it. And he had all these other things to do, but he thought about who should be justice, and conferring with Justice Roberts, and I think also probably Charles Evans Hughes, as to a list of who might be considered. But this was the old boy network. In those days, the Supreme Court was not as prominent in the public mind as it is today. And so Burton was appointed. Next came Fred Vinson, who was appointed Chief Justice. Vinson had been on a court. He'd been Secretary of the Treasury, among other offices. And the Supreme Court was not happy at the time. Frankfurter, Douglas, Black, Jackson, all contending with each other, and the court was an unhappy place. And Truman thought that good old poker playing, friendly Fred Vinson would bring peace to the court. As it turned out, it didn't work. They didn't respect Vinson's legal ability. The third appointment Truman made to this court was of Tom Clark, who turned out to be a very, very powerful and influential justice. He wrote Heart of Atlanta Motel and Katzenbach versus McClung, which allowed Congress to insist that even small little restaurants could not discriminate against people based on their color or their race. And he wrote Mapp versus Ohio, one of the most important civil rights cases in the criminal area that we have. The final appointment was Sherman Minton. Neither Minton nor Burton nor Vinson left great opinions. But as it turned out, Clark, Minton, and Burton were very important in keeping the court together when Earl Warren came and the Brown versus Board of Education case was re-argued. Brown versus Board of Education was first argued under Vinson. And notes show that Vinson actually would have ruled the other way. He would have allowed separate but equal. Separate but equal sounds so fair, but it really isn't. It's degrading. It's demeaning. It's damaging to those who have to be separated by reason of race. And it was argued before Vinson. The court couldn't agree, so they rescheduled for oral argument. Vinson died. Earl Warren is appointed. Earl Warren then works to get a unanimous opinion. And it was critical that he had the help of Clark, Minton, and Burton to get the court together. They were so that is an important legacy of Truman. Truman himself had desegregated the military. He was the first one to speak to the NAACP, and so he was moving in that direction. A final case is the steel seizure case. At the height of the Korean War, there was a steel strike. And the real concern was that this would cause a severe shortage, could cause a severe shortage of ammunition when we were fighting a vicious war. So after some preliminaries, Truman seized the steel mills. He said, as President of the United States, these mills are now owned by the United States government, and we will solve the labor problem. Case went to the Supreme Court. The steel company said, well, how can you take over our property? And in a divided opinion, Truman lost the case. But as it turned out, the steel strike was soon ended. But again, Truman accepted the result. He accepted the result. Just as Nixon accepted the result when he was ordered to deliver the tapes. Truman set that example. My time, you've been very patient. I sure it's gone by too quickly. But let me just say this, particularly to the young people. It never occurred to me that this would happen. But over the last 10 years especially, democracy is receding in many parts of the world. Countries that once were free no longer are. This must be corrected, and this is the challenge you young people face. And the way you meet that challenge is to know our history as Truman knew it. To know that we are a nation that's proud to be free and proud to have a destiny to give that freedom to others. This is what Harry Truman wanted. This is what this award you so graciously bestow on me reminds us of. And you must remember that the work of freedom is never done. Thank you very much.